Hello, and may Yod-He Vav-He, the creator of heaven and earth, richly bless you. My name is Brother Michael Langford, and I would like to welcome you once again to our next installment in Old Testament discipleship. I appreciate you joining me and joining with me as we study Yahweh's Word together. May Yahweh bless and keep you. Once again, we remind you, as we often do in this class, that this set of video classes is intended to inform, to educate, to inspire, and to challenge you to excellence in Messiah. Remember that it is your job to search out these things that we say, search them out and study them out biblically for yourself. Expect to be challenged. One of the dynamics of any group culture, and that includes Christian faith communities among all the others, is that we often develop a technical jargon or a technical way of speaking to one another so that we develop a verbal shorthand. And one of the verbal shorthands we use is a phrase called be a Berean. The problem is that many people don't understand what it means to be a Berean. The phrase be a Berean is really Christian shorthand for a preacher using with his flock to say, check out everything I preach with scripture and make sure that it lines up. It's basically a way of a preacher reminding his flock that it is their responsibility to check everything that they hear from the pulpit with scripture. While that understanding for that phrase is certainly the true one, that understanding does not do the phrase justice. The Bereans are far more intricate and far more of a blessing to the body of Messiah than we understand. Just as it is written, then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. Acts 17:10. Now, these, referring to the Bereans, were more fair-minded than those of Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness, and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. Acts 17:11. When we understand both the historical and the biblical accounts of the Bereans, we see how truly heroic these Bereans actually were. A lot of people might say, well, there are only 3 or 4 scriptures about the Bereans. Why do you consider them heroic? I consider the Bereans heroic for 4 major reasons. The first is that they were fair-minded. The second is they were willing to listen. The third is that they tested everything by scripture. But the most important one is that in order to become the kinds of people that would test everything by scriptures, that would be willing and able to test everything by their scriptures, they would have had to overcome an enormous amount of religious upbringing in order to learn to test everything by scripture. So they're heroic because they overcame religious upbringing to seek and to learn the truth for themselves. And you get that understanding from understanding the historical context of rabbinical Judaism. Before we can understand the critical contribution of the Bereans, we first have to have some understanding of first century rabbinical Judaism, which is much different than biblical Judaism. Rabbinical Judaism definitely did not teach people to live according to the written scriptures. Now remember, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had several ideas in rabbinical Judaism that were the opposite of what scripture said. A few of them were that there was no salvation for any non-native born Israelite. So if you weren't a native born Hebrew, you couldn't get saved no matter what you did. Rabbinical teachings had more authority than the written scriptures, and disobeying the rabbi leads to hell. They also believed that the rabbis could make the scriptures become null and void if enough rabbis agreed. The concept of papal infallibility and the authority of the Roman Catholic Church was stolen first from rabbinical Judaism. Don't forget also that the rabbis and the teachers of the law also said regularly that their personal teachings and traditions were part of Yahweh's law. In other words, they were as important or more important than the written scriptures, even though this was not true biblically. Please do not miss this great important historical context. Messiah, the apostles, and the Christians of the first century stood against these rabbinical and non-biblical doctrines and ideas. They were teaching against the rabbinical system because it was not biblical. Now the Bereans are in a huge dilemma. And the dilemma is, which is right? Either Paul and the apostles are right and Yeshua is in fact the Messiah and Paul and the apostles are telling the truth, or the rabbis are right and Messiah, or what we call Messiah, was a false prophet and deserved to die. If the rabbis are right, then the Bereans would be sinning even by questioning the rabbis and not obeying what the rabbis said. If the rabbis are wrong and the apostles are right, then we can't reject the Messiah or we'd be in trouble with Yahweh. So what do we do? And more importantly, what criterion do we use to decide who's right and who's wrong? Because again, according to the rabbinical system, the rabbinical teaching tradition of the elders is higher and has more authority than the scriptures. So if we use scripture as our authority and it turns out we're wrong, then the rabbis are right and we've sinned and we deserve to die. That's the dilemma that the Bereans were facing. I consider the Bereans to be entirely heroic because they would have overcome an enormous amount of traditional rabbinical religious tradition in order to come to the decision that they were going to allow the written scriptures to help them decide who was telling the truth and who was wrong regarding this Yeshua of Nazareth. Was he the Messiah or was he not the Messiah? We're going to allow scripture to decide for us. And they searched the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. But in order to come to that decision, they had to overcome a tremendous amount of religious background. By the way, here's a question that we don't often think about. Which scriptures did the Bereans actually use? Which scriptures did they search daily to see if whether the apostles were telling the truth or not? So they were only using the books of Genesis to Malachi to check Paul's theology. We know for a fact that the Bereans didn't have any such thing as the New Testament at the time, so the only books they could have used were Genesis to Malachi. For example, if Paul had been teaching, hey, go ahead, Messiah died on your behalf, so you are now free to break the seventh-day Sabbath. Don't honor the seventh-day Sabbath anymore. Don't bother keeping the fourth commandment. Now you're free to copy pagan sun god worship traditions and worship on Sunday mornings, the first day of the week, and change it to a new Sabbath. The Bereans would not have believed him, because they were reviewing Paul's teachings through the Old Testament scriptures, and they would be reading the scriptures that say that Yahweh's commandments endure forever and that Yahweh is not going to change. So if Paul had been teaching against keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, as most Christians claim, the Bereans could not have believed him. If Paul had been teaching, hey, don't honor the Passover meal anymore because Messiah died, so you don't have to do that anymore. Instead, copy pagan customs and traditions in your communion services because Yeshua died on your behalf, so he won't care if you imitate pagan customs. The Bereans would never have believed Paul, because such a horrendous idea violates all kinds of scriptures which the Bereans would have used. If Paul had been teaching or had had a reputation for teaching, hey, don't bother keeping the Feast of Tabernacles in Leviticus 23 anymore, don't bother obeying that. Instead, if you want to honor the birth of Messiah, copy pagan winter solstice traditions and celebrate him along with every other pagan sun god on December 25th. The Bereans would never have believed anything Paul said regarding Yeshua being Messiah. Because again, such an idea violates so much scriptures which the Bereans had, it would not be funny. If Paul had been preaching, hey, don't bother honoring the spring feasts of Yahweh anymore, don't bother honoring the life, death, and resurrection of Messiah through the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, or Pentecost anymore. Instead, disobey those scriptures and celebrate the resurrection of Messiah through Babylonian pagan Ishtar festival traditions, the Bereans would never have believed anything he said about Messiah. Let's remember what it says. And these, the Bereans, were more fair-minded than those of Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness, and they searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. Acts 17:11. It says, therefore, many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, prominent women as well as men. So the result of their scripture search was that it caused them to believe Paul's message. As a result of their scriptural search, the Bereans believed Paul's message about the Messiah. If Paul was teaching, do not obey the Old Testament, the Bereans would not have believed him. If Paul was teaching, do the opposite of what the Old Testament says, the Bereans would not have believed that he was telling the truth. The Bereans believed Paul's message about the Messiah after they searched the Old Testament daily, which is all they would have had. If Paul had been preaching against the Old Testament, the Bereans would not have believed him. And since the Bereans believed him after searching the scriptures, Paul could not have been preaching against the Old Testament scriptures as most Christians today believe. Sooner or later, every generation, indeed every believer, is confronted with a choice. We all must choose. Will we be a Christian version of a Pharisee who base our lives and our beliefs and our religions based on human rules, customs, and traditions which we have learned over centuries? Or will we be like the brave Bereans? Will we be open to listen, but will we give Scripture the ultimate authority about what we will believe and how we will live? Each of us must choose. Speaking for myself, I choose to labor so that I may be counted among the brave Bereans, who are open to listen and receive the word with readiness, but who daily search the scriptures to see what the truth really is. Thank you for joining me. May Yahweh bless you. Until next time, Shalom.